as well as mapping. And so, first thing I want to mention, which Sophie mentioned, is this little information button on the top right corner here, right by where you log in. There's information on how to get support, training, and to our community forums where you can actually put in the support ticket. You can also put in a support request by emailing support@functionpoint.com. We do have a turnaround time right now above an hour. Again, it depends how busy we get. We try to get as fast as we can, but usually takes about an hour to get back. But yeah, we do again do our best, and we'll try to get back to you as quick as possible. And then you've got your webinars where you can sign up for the webinars. I know Sophie mentioned that we are taking a little bit of a break, but when we do come back, that's exactly where you'd want to go to register for them. And of course, our submit an idea. A lot of product work gets done. Sometimes there's some features that you want that we don't have. Best thing to do is come onto this information button, submit an idea, and track where it is in the feature request cycle. And so that's my little spill about how you can contact us and the different ways of things that we have offering here at Function Point. I'll right back into the topic at hand, QuickBooks Online overview. I just want to specifically kind of start with what QuickBooks Online integration is. It's an integration that we use with QuickBooks Online through their online technology called their SDK. Oh, it looks like I already have a question.
I'm so sorry, Jeremy. We just had someone comment that your screen's a little bit wide. Could we just shrink it down a little bit? I know you have your super fancy screens, but yeah.
Let's see if this will work.
Even just narrowing the browser window.
Let me try a different browser. Might just be the size of my actual monitor. Give me 1 second, everybody. We'll try a different one and see what happens here. Is that any better?
That looks better on my end. Thanks, Jer. Tom, if you have any comments you want to make, just let me know.
All right, so unfortunately, yes, technology can be our friend and it can also be a curse. And this time it's definitely going to be our friend now that we've got it set up. So QuickBooks Online. QuickBooks Online, again, is a tool made by Intuit that works with Function Point as well. And we use what's called QuickBooks Technology SDK, which allows our web server to talk to their web server. And one of those things with the integration is a click of a button here sends the data over there. Now, if for whatever reason QuickBooks Online account is having issues, you'll probably notice that Function Point won't sync over. Now, that's something that we can resolve easily by resyncing with QuickBooks Online. Now, if it's something that's on their side, unfortunately, it is a wait to have them fix it so that you can actually get going again. If it's on our side, definitely support here is helping you through that process. We will get you up and running. I do want to mention with the fact that we're using their technology to sync over into QuickBooks Online, every 90 days, the integration does need to be reinitiated. And when I'm talking about the reinitiated, when you try to sync, you're going to get an error message saying you're disconnected currently from QuickBooks. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go into QuickBooks integration here under Integrate Accounting, and you're going to hit the Reconnect button. There's going to be a button here instead of saying disconnect, it's going to say Reconnect, and that's going to reconnect you with QuickBooks Online. And that does happen every 90 days. That's just because they need to refresh their ID with Function Point. It's kind of like if you have a Gmail account and you sign in a browser, it says, would you like to remember me for 30 days? And you hit yes. Similar, QuickBooks allows you to remember us for 90 days. And what I kind of want to show you is the overview of what syncs. Now, with the integration, a lot of people ask us, can this go here? Can this go there? Can contacts do not actually sync into QuickBooks? What does sync into QuickBooks is the customer record as well as the invoice with the line items and the line item service names. I want to be kind of clear with that. A lot of people ask us, the service names on the invoice are account services, for example, photography and printing. If you come in and you actually put in a transaction and you put in a description, at this point, unfortunately, it won't sync, but these names do. So for a little bit of a workaround, if you actually type in your description here, a brief description, and that will sync. And a lot of people, want to be able to send invoices from QuickBooks, but can't because it says account services twice. A little bit of that workaround again is to put in the description. Again, it needs to be brief. It needs to be about 50 characters. I think it's about 50, 60 characters in length, and that will actually transfer over and show up as. Let's pull up an invoice here so I can show you what that looks like. So as you can see, the product comes in because that's the mapped item, and then we'll get into the mapping in just a moment. I just want to kind of show you, again, the high-level overview of what comes in. And so it's the product and service, and what's called the description is actually just the name from function point again. So if you, again, go back into that naming field and type in something a little bit different here, the invoice in QuickBooks picks that up. And I know in the future releases of our FP Accountant, the description for the service line items are potentially going to flow in so that you don't have to use that workaround. Just want to keep touching base on that in case a lot of people out there are wondering how they can get a better description on the invoice in QuickBooks without having to manually touch the QuickBooks. I'm not sure if anyone has mentioned before with dealing with QuickBooks Online, once you modify something in QuickBooks, it's going to throw an error and let you know that it's actually been modified in QuickBooks. Please modify it in function point. It is a one-way sync, but QuickBooks does know when something doesn't match function point, and because function point is technically seen as the parent in the relationship, it needs to be updated before the child can get updated. It's kind of like going to the candy store. You have to ask the parent for money to buy the candy. So we want to make sure that we always update the parent so that the actual transaction in QuickBooks is what you're expecting it to be, and we don't have any errors. Now, just on screen here, I just wanted to show you again what comes through. The line items come through, the rates come through, the tax, if you had tax on the invoice, come through, the billing address and the shipping address, the invoice date, and the due date. If you kind of look at the very bottom here, you'll see a statement memo. If I had that feature turned on, that statement memo would actually be the job name and number. And that would just be, again, coming from function point, it's just the job, name and number, and that's just a way for you to know exactly what invoice this is attached to. With QuickBooks Online, by default, because they don't actually have jobs in QuickBooks Online, everything's being defaulted to the company level. We do have a little bit of a trick where we can make it go to the sub-customer, which if you look at it, it looks the same as a job. It's just an extra line under the customer record. And what that kind of would look like would be coming into our sales and coming to our customers. And then you'd have Flight Center with Studio J right underneath it. So this technically is a sub-customer, but we can make it have the job information so you can still have that level of actual, I want to call it transaction history with that level of information attached to it. Now, the other thing we want to touch base is what comes back into function point. Now, we keep talking about a one-way sync. Now, when you actually create the payment in QuickBooks and you run a full sync from QuickBooks Online, and again, anything that needs to be updated with QuickBooks Online is going to be done through the admin section, integrate accounting, and set up QuickBooks integration. You'll see this perform full sync with QuickBooks. That will actually push payments back into function point. And what that really does is on the invoice itself, there will be a little spot here that says payment method, payment amount, and payment date. That will be populated with what is set up. And so in this case, I haven't accepted the payment yet, but if I did, it would be for $82.20, and the payment method I would be using as a check, and it would be the date that the check was put through in QuickBooks Online. Now, I kind of want to talk a little bit more on the buttons here, so you can see that this one says export, which means the actual status means that that invoice should be in QuickBooks. If it's unposted, then that means that it's ready to go into QuickBooks Online, and that you'll actually have to come into the invoice itself, click on the export button for it to go through. If you see something like this, let me just actually show you. If you see something like this, export out of sync, that means that the record was in QuickBooks and has been modified in function point, and the details need to be pushed back into QuickBooks. That means even if, like you saw there, I didn't save anything, the system still sees it triggered as you saved the invoice again. And most of the time there will be data changes. So there'll be like $1 here or a service name here change. It just lets us know as a user that, hey, you know what, something's not right. There's data that's been changed. Let's go ahead and make sure that QuickBooks has that new information. So then we'd come back and hit the export updates to QuickBooks. And what that does is, like it says, export updates to the accounting package. In this case, that's going to be QuickBooks. For whatever reason you come in and you don't want the changes to be pushed to QuickBooks, you'll see this fancy stop sync button. Now what that does is it stops the actual invoice from going into QuickBooks and stops the integration from looking for that invoice behind the scenes, so you won't get an error message on that. When I say you won't get an error message, a lot of the time things are updated and they're just not in sync. You'll get an error message, something around the lines of edit sequence, ID, X, Y, and Z has been updated and QuickBooks doesn't match function point, or vice versa. And that just basically means that, again, the invoice in one of the systems doesn't have the same information. If that's okay with you, you can hit the stop sync button, and that will actually stop the sync process, and those error messages will cancel themselves out the next time you run a full sync. And I just want to touch base on one other thing. You know, a lot of people asking me how I can export multiple invoices at the same time with QuickBooks Online. The desktop has a lovely feature where you can do multiple at the same time by just marking them all as posted and then running this desktop sync, and it transfers it all. QuickBooks Online does have a similar feature, a little more clicks, but it does the same process. If you come into Find Invoice and you look for a status unposted, now probably be a bad example. I probably only have 1 or 2, or I might have none. Well, there we go. We've got 7. So this is actually a great opportunity to show you what that looks like. So now you can come and click Export. And this is going to give you all the available invoices that can export into QuickBooks Online. And if you look here, we've got this export button. So similar to on the individual invoice page, you can click the export button. Depends on your workflow. Do you want to export every invoice one by one as soon as they're created, get them into QuickBooks so your accountant knows that you're up to date with your finances? Or do you want to do it on a weekly or daily basis? If you decide that you do want to do it on a weekly or daily basis, you do have that option by going again to that invoice find for unposted, getting the result page here, and then going through export, export, export. I always recommend giving about 5 seconds before the clicks, just so that the process can take place for the first entry, so that you know, a lot of individuals may have a slow internet connection and they click export, and by the time they get to the second one, the first one hasn't exported yet. When they look in QuickBooks, just making sure that you give the time for the first invoice and the second invoice and the third invoice and the fourth invoice and so on to go over. It is, again, web-based, so it is based upon your internet speed, and if your ISP is having a little bit of a network kerfuffle that day, or people are watching YouTube during lunch and it's slowing down the internet connection, it's just being mindful of giving those transactions a bit of time to end up in QuickBooks. Now, we touched a lot of invoicing. I just wanted to quickly touch base on expenses before we move to the mapping. And looking at expenses, I'm just going to come into expenses, find an expense. You can see I've got quite a few in the system and already exported. What's going to end up coming in to QuickBooks is this expense as a bill. So what that means is when you come into QuickBooks, you're going to go into your expenses side, which they've lovely renamed. It used to be vendors, and then you'd go to the vendor, and then you'd see the expenses. The great thing with QuickBooks Online is they're always updating their UI. They're adding new features, refreshing the screens and the layouts. They always keep you on your toes on what they're doing next. So if you're on the desktop version, or you're thinking about moving to the QuickBooks Online version and you're on this call watching this video, just looking at maybe potentially moving to QuickBooks Online. They are pushing the QuickBooks Online a little bit more than the desktop as far as features and enhancement speeds. So I always, recommend taking a look at it and seeing if that's something that might fit your requirements. So we're going to be going into a bill here, for example. And as far as what syncs over, the vendor name syncs over, the vendor address, the terms, the date, and the due date. And you'll see that it actually syncs over the cost of goods sold with the amount, and it actually does link it to the customer. And one thing I do want to mention, to get the customer names and the vendor names into QuickBooks, the sync does have to have a transaction against it. So what I mean by that is if you have company ABC and they're not in QuickBooks quite yet, you'll actually have to create an invoice in function point for ABC and hit the export button. That invoice will then populate into QuickBooks as well as the customer. And similar with the vendor is if you have, in this case, ABC agency, if you have them in function point but not in QuickBooks, by adding that expense against them in function point and clicking that export button to bring them into QuickBooks, that will add the vendor record as well as the bill. Now, when I've got the cursor on the customer, in order for that customer to show up and have that linkage, the customer has to have an invoice in the system attached to this same job. So in this case, the job that this expense is on is associated to job 1004. So there would have to be a North Show Auto Group invoice against that job in QuickBooks to have it show as the customer on this actual expense. And I'm just going to kind of pause for a moment and see if there's any questions that have come up, Sophie, or anything that needs to be answered before we move on to the mapping side of things.
Hey, Jer. Yeah, thanks for checking in. You know what? We've got a pretty quiet group here today, so just a friendly reminder: don't be scared to ask me questions. Yeah, send them on through. I guess my question for you, Jeremy: do you watch YouTube videos during your lunch break? Like you made a comment on slowing down our Wi-Fi. Like what?
That wasn't me. That would probably be Ryan. I know he really likes to watch his YouTube and watch his Facebook videos as well. And I'm just giving Ryan a hard time. He's our boss. Want to make sure that he gets kind of thrown under the rug once in a while if I can, just to be a fair bit on him.
I don't even know if he'll hear this comment. I'm going to forward it to him later.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to kind of touch base because, again, with it being internet technologies, any slowdown. Now, I always say YouTube because they use a lot of resources as far as watching and streaming the videos. Takes up a lot of bandwidth on the internet connection, so that's why I used YouTube as an example. Similar process if you've got designers that are uploading design layouts to client sites or portals to share with their clients. If they're uploading videos or larger than, say 20 meg type PDFs or JPEGs or audio clips or anything like that, that would slow down your internet as well, which may cause a slowdown with function points integration.
Well, we had a couple questions come in while we were bantering there, so maybe we should address them before we move on, Jer. We actually just had Tammy ask what shows in QuickBooks if they don't have an invoice against the client.
So if they don't have an invoice against the client, the bill will still come in with the vendor attached to it. The customer field here on the actual bill though will be blank. And you'll see this set as an outstanding bill against no customer. And so with QuickBooks Online, now this might be a bad example because they did recently change it, so I might have to look at this. On their dashboard, if you've got certain settings, you'll see expenses and you'll see, yeah, this is a bad example because they don't actually have that dashboard anymore, but there would have been a graph like this one right here where you've got open invoices. There would have been one with expenses that said unattached or invoice not, the actual terminology was invoice not billed. And what that basically meant, if you went to look at the expense, because it wasn't linked to that customer, you basically looked like the bill wasn't attached to the revenue side, so it looked like you still had an outstanding balance that needed to be invoiced on the customer side.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jer. And then we also have Shireen here saying, if there is an invoice, will the bill be added to the invoice? And what would that look like?
So the bill won't be technically added to the invoice. When you create an invoice in Function Point and you bill from actuals, now again, this might, perfect example, I just happened to pull this one up. You'll see the external expense here for printing. You created the external expense, which was the bill, in the expense module. You create the invoice from actuals, and then it will pull in that external expense printing, and you'll see that the actual value is $360. So then you would actually invoice that $360. When that invoice comes into QuickBooks, let's see if we can actually do that here. Let's just bring this in. Now bear with me, ladies and gentlemen, if it doesn't work the first time. Sometimes my demos don't work as well as I hope, and it did perfectly. So when you bring this in, export it in, you'll see this invoice now. I'm just going to grab this for Pete's Meats Butchers. And I believe it was done. Let's do this by date, today's date, and let's just grab that invoice number to make sure that I got the right one. Now, speaking of invoice numbers, you might just see a couple invoices come through that don't have a dash behind them. They just have a number. Those are batch invoices. And you'll notice in function point, there's a B in front of them. When they come into QuickBooks, they don't actually continue to have that B. They just have that number. So I just want to mention that just in case you're deciding to switch to function point, QuickBooks Online integration, and you already have invoices in QuickBooks Online that have a certain number range, please reach out to the support department so we can increase your number range so that you're not having invoices duplicated or overridden because of the naming convention. So you'll see the invoice here that we just brought in. You've got the printing. And if you actually take a look here, if you go to your more options and you look at your transaction journal, you'll see right now that the current transactions printing are going against sales revenue. When you create the expense, it's attached to the job 1008, and then you bring that expense into QuickBooks. You'll see that the expense will have a cost of goods sold of $360, and that will go against your accounts payable. And then you'll see that there has reference to 1008 as that job, and you'll notice that that cancels out the right side of the transaction.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Also, a follow-up from Shireen. This might be more of a function point question unless you can think of a way to track it in QuickBooks. Sometimes they need to invoice for more or less than the actual hours spent. Is that something we can keep track of? That'll definitely be something we can keep track of in function point, and I would be happy to organize a time to connect with you, Shireen, to walk through your workflow together and make sure that you're good with reporting on items like that. And just one more question for you, Jer. We had Chuck that was just asking why the customer sometimes says base. I'm not familiar with this. Is this something that rings a bell to you?
Yeah, it definitely does. This goes back to many a blue moons ago when the actual function point system had a base company as the office. And what that really means is if I come in here, for example, and I looked up my actual office being the company that I work for in the system, and I go to the office and I hit find companies, you'll see I got a bunch of test companies, and my real company is ABC Agency. And you'll see here that my QuickBooks customer name is Base. And the reason behind that most of the time is when you're creating expenses for yourself, for your office, you don't want it to be the same name as the company because you may get confused with who the transaction belongs to on that side. And you really don't invoice yourself most of the time, so you would want a different name as far as the naming convention. And you can see here I used ABC Agency _ vendor, and I left my QuickBooks customer name as Base. Now, if Base was just something that nomenclature that was decided upon again many years ago. If you want to come in and change it, you can definitely do so. All you would do is come into your office record, and you're going to click on the Edit Details button, and you can change it to whatever you want, or you can just remove it and keep something a little bit different as the vendor name. How are we doing
Okay.
for questions there, Sophie?
I think we're good. Thank you, everyone. You really livened us up a little bit there, but we've started going a little bit quiet, so I think moving on to mapping now. Thanks, Jer.
Perfect, no problem. So let's touch base on the mapping and what the mapping looks like. The first thing I really want to touch base upon is the drop-down menus in function point. Where is that information coming from, you might ask? That information is actually coming from your products and service lists. I know it's a little bit tricky. It does say income in the brackets in function point. That's because all these services are going to be linked to an income item of some sort. And what I mean that is if I come to account services here and I click edit, you can see that it's linked to the income account. You don't have an option for an expense account. It's account services going to an income type. And the account services means that it's going to design when it hits your, your profit and loss statement and your trial balances. The income's going into your design revenue account. But if you ran a sales report based upon items or services, then you could see the monetary value being at the company name level as account services. And when it comes into function point, you'll see the drop-down menu. I'll have to go back to my invoice here. You'll see the drop-down menu in the left corner. You'll see that account services. That's that exact same naming that's coming from QuickBooks. You might ask, well, how come I only have a few in this list? These are the items that I've decided to create as items in QuickBooks and map in function point. So I'm going to take you to the mapping services and expenses page right now, and we can talk a little bit of one, where did they come from, and two, how do I get more in there? And three also is I want to update one because one doesn't exist anymore. I need to rename it. What happens in that case? And so we're going to mouse over admin, integrate accounting, set up QuickBooks integration, and we're going to go to the services tab. Now on the services tab, again, it says income item. Again, because of where the money lands against that service, we're calling it an income item, but it is products and services in the products and services list. And you'll see here that I don't actually have one called administrative services. Now, if I did and it was spelled exactly the same, it would be auto-mapped. One great thing about it is if the syntax matches, the service name, account services in both systems, it automatically maps it for you, and all you have to do is hit the save button. But let's say, for example, it didn't. Or let's say, for example, I don't want it against the actual same service. I could say account services is really freelancer time. So then I would set it up against freelancer. When I go to create the invoice, it then would automatically be mapped to freelancer on the drop-down menu. And similar process with expenses. The only difference with the expenses, it has the two options here for the QuickBooks income, and that is the left side, which goes on the customer-facing invoice. And then we have the right-hand side, which is actually the expense mapping. And the expense mapping goes against the expense type or COGS account type. A lot of clients ask us, is there a way to go through like a 6,000 range or a 7,000 range because you want it as a deferred account or you want it through a through and through account? At this time, we can only write to cost of goods sold accounts or expense type accounts. So you may have to move the service in your chart of accounts to a different number range or a different type to be able to get the expense through function point. And the question really was, what happens if I don't want it anymore, or if I need to change the name from function point or QuickBooks? All you will really need to do is come into the actual products and services for the services side, for the revenue side of things that go into customer-facing invoice. We're going to come in, for example, and hit services here, and we're going to say services, let's call it services demo. So we're going to hit save and close. We're now got a new name attached to it. We're going to come back here to our trusty perform full sync, and through the power of technology, we're going to get all the checks across the board, and then I'll be able to close this window. And you might see your checkbox is taking a little bit longer. My system's really plain and vanilla. If you've got a couple of years of stored data, or if you've moved from a desktop version to an online version, your system's going to have more data and more transactions to check over in the system, so it may be a little bit longer. I know a full sync for some clients can take up to 2 hours, and that's because they have 5 years of stored transactions in their QuickBooks file. So I'm going to go ahead and click close. And then if we come back to our services tab now that we're refreshed, you can see now that the name has changed. And a simple change in function point 2 to match, all you're going to do is click on the navigate to the FP internal services, and you're going to change the name by clicking on the edit pencil button in here. And now you can go ahead and edit the details. And now they are all the same far as their naming convention goes for this one service. Again, you can come in and make this one inactive if you want. Similar process in QuickBooks. If you don't want it anymore, you can just come into it itself and go to edit, and there is an option to actually make this inactive. Now, my version of QuickBooks, I don't have that option available right this minute, just because it is currently just the basic version of QuickBooks Online. There are 2 versions of QuickBooks Online we do currently support. It is the, I believe they're still calling it the Enterprise Edition, or the, let's actually look that one up to make sure I'm 100% right on this one. There is the QuickBooks Accountant copy, as well as the QuickBooks Enterprise version. Now there is a new one that just came on the market, which just allows for invoicing. It doesn't actually allow for bills processing. So that one definitely does not work, because we do write to both invoices and bills. You'll need the next level up. Now, if I actually just double check one thing, let's just go to QuickBooks Online, because I know that they're changing their marketing around as well. And I just want to make sure that we are looking at the proper naming. And so let's just go to QuickBooks Online. And so yeah, so they just changed their naming as well. So the Easy Start, which is a brand new one, which just allows your income and bare expense GL transactions. And then there's the Essentials, which is the bare one that we can really work with. We always suggest using what used to be called the Enterprise, which is now called the Plus, just because it gives you all the features, and we are guaranteed to work with this integration because it does allow all transactions to go through and allows payments to come back. Whereas this one, for example, doesn't allow purchase orders, and it doesn't allow tracking of inventory. And you'll see Easy Start does not allow paying the bill, so then the transactions wouldn't have payments updated in function point. And we just want to make sure that you guys are set up for success. So always recommend using the Essentials or Plus, and that would get you the best chances for success with the integration. And now coming back into the mapping, I do want to touch base on a couple more areas of mapping. So we're just going to come back into the mapping page for a moment. A lot of people, I would like to say, collect or create deposit invoices. Now, when I say deposit invoices, it's really collecting an upfront amount from a client, so it's sitting there, and then you're going to use that invoice against other invoices that come through. So let's say a client gives you $5,000, you're going to create multiple invoices, and you're going to deduct that deposit from those invoices. So they were technically paying $0 invoices till that deposit's being used up. If you invoice in that type of workflow, you're going to need to create a deposit item in QuickBooks. And by denoted by the tooltip here, it is an other charge that's mapped to an other current liability. The biggest thing too is that it is created as an other current liability in your general ledger account, as well as created as an item in your QuickBooks products and services, and then mapped to that other current liability. Just, I've seen a lot of time people create the other current liability account and they forget to create that service, and then they try to create the deposit and they can't. I also want to kind of touch base on the taxes just roughly here. So I'm using a Canadian version of QuickBooks. So we've got QuickBooks tax codes, and we've also got items. These are also pulled from the QuickBooks tax section. For whatever reason you've got a tax that's non-taxable set to 0%, it's not going to be an option to map to the tax groups used in function point. Please make sure that if you have a tax that you're applying to an invoice or an expense, that it is a positive amount in the rate section so that it can be used and then can be actually transferred into QuickBooks when you have it on the invoice. If for whatever reason you have got like a GST or let's say California state tax and it's set to 0%, your invoice is going to error saying the tax cannot be in, has to be a positive amount, can't be a negative amount, or it has to have an amount. those will kind of stop the integrations and kind of get you kind of needing to go back a step and setting those taxes up. So I just, again, make sure that your items are set up, your taxes are set up, and your general ledger accounts are set up. And then I don't foresee any integration errors around the mapping side of things, which brings me into the naming conventions. Now I'm just going to stop for a moment and kind of pause. I know that's a lot of information that I just went into, a lot of detail. If there's any questions about that topic, Sophie, that's coming up.
Hey, Jer. Thanks again for checking in. No, I think that was all pretty straightforward, but thank you for reviewing it.
No problem. So let's move on to naming convention. Now, naming convention is kind of mixed with limitations of QuickBooks. I really want to touch base on the naming conventions. Now, if you ever visit the support site, our support site is very handy as far as QuickBooks videos and how-tos. If you ever have an error that you're not sure about, if you put in, like I was going to say Google it, but if you actually put in support, if you go to, if you search for FP accountant errors, there's going to be an actual PDF that actually has pretty much every error message possible and steps to resolve it. And you'll see that majority of them are based upon naming conventions. With that, naming conventions with QuickBooks, QuickBooks itself allows certain characters if you manually put them in. However, QuickBooks does not allow certain characters if you're using their integration into QuickBooks. And what I mean by that is if you have an and symbol or an ampersand and you have that in the customer name, it doesn't like that. Unfortunately, it's like one of those relatives that you have to go visit once in a while. Sometimes you have a good experience, sometimes you don't. It's one of those things where it may go in correctly and it may not. So we always want to verify that we take those characters out, again, to set you up for success. You know, it's really good to remove those characters and keep the naming convention as straightforward as possible with the companies. You know, like INC periods, great, works. But if you're using like hard white space where you're hitting enter and you got like an underscore or closed bracket or squiggly bracket or an asterisk or anything like that, those type of characters will cause the names not to read the invoices correctly and will not read the name correctly. So you could either have the invoice go to the wrong company with a similar name, or it may create no record in QuickBooks. And again, we just want to make sure that we avoid that. And kind of as far as the naming convention goes, there is a limit to how many characters you can use as far as the customer names, vendor names, and names in general on the fields. So when I say about that, I'm just going to go back to the invoice here so we can be on par what I'm talking about. The company name. Now, we're going to bring this up so we can actually take a look at the company names. Company names, you know, they're allowed 30 characters. If you try to map to a company name that has more than 30 characters, you may see it truncated, or you may get an error saying, you know, the company character limit has been reached, and then you'll end up having to adjust the company name and try to resync again. Also, with the descriptions, if you're using description fields for the expenses, we want to keep it to a minimum character count as well. I believe it's 100, 150 characters. Now, with these fields, please don't copy and paste. When you copy and paste from, let's say, Word or the web, they sometimes have characters that you can't see in front of you. They're those ones that are behind the scene that you'd actually have to copy and paste into a text editor, and then you'd actually see them and they'd be visible. I call them ghost characters. And what those ghost characters do are cause errors with the integration because they're unsupported and they just can't allow the transaction to come into QuickBooks with those characters. And a lot of the time you'll see an error, it looks like it says Swedish syntax. It actually means the MySQL error syntax. And that really means whenever you see that syntax error, that means there's characters that are unsupported in one of the naming fields. So it could be the company name, the description name, or the service name. And it's great just to make sure that, you know, he has a little bit more work, but let's just go ahead and type those descriptions in and type the names in just to make sure there aren't any of those ghost characters coming around. And since we are a little bit of a segue into the limitations of QuickBooks, I kind of just want to touch base on that. I'm just going to bring up an article here for a second. let's just see if I can find it here without divulging too much other things. You know what? I'm just going to pause my screen just for 1 second to make sure that I bring up the right article. Just bear with me 1 second here. Perfect. Okay. Thank you for your patience, everybody. When you've got multiple screens with multiple things open, I just want to make sure that you're looking at the correct thing. And I just wanted to bring up this. So this actual is the FP frequent errors, and that's that article that I was talking about. If you go to the support form and you type in FP account errors, it will give you this PDF. And it actually is an Excel sheet that myself and the support team work on a daily basis to make sure that everything is up and ready to go. And you'll see here, for example, a lot of the time property names instinct specified as unsupported. That just means, again, invalid characters or character limits are in the job name or company name. Again, I mentioned a few different characters, but you can see here, please look at these different ones. The at symbol, the ampersand, and the semicolon are mischiefy. And you'll notice that the memo fields only allow 250 characters, and the PO fields only allow 14 characters. As long as you kind of follow that process and have the limits to what you put into those transactions, you should have a successful sync. At any time you get an error message, the best thing to do is to go to a review posted items, which I will show you just in 2 moments here. But I just want to touch base on a couple more kind of limitations where it really depends on your integration. Now, with QuickBooks Online, you'll probably get the one that says QuickBooks is trying to add a customer. Please make sure both systems match. That's, for example, if QuickBooks has customer ABC agency and so does Function Point, but the name is spelled a little bit differently or was renamed, or the addresses don't match, or there's extra white spaces. So just keeping kind of in mind when you're trying to sync with 2 applications, to keep them as close, well, we're going to say as close as possible, but we really need them identical to make sure that there are no issues coming up. And just looking at a couple more just limitations here is looking at transactions. When you have a customer, let's say that's inactive, and you're trying to push an invoice into QuickBooks with an inactive customer, a lot of the time you're going to get this temp number error. The temp number error to yourselves are probably going to be, what the heck, I don't know what's going on. But to us, it just basically means that temp means that it's in a temporary place right now. It couldn't put a transaction into QuickBooks, and the ID is usually linked to a customer or the job. And customer, in this case 358, wouldn't sync because it had a special character in it and it errored out, so the invoice itself couldn't go through. Some other ones I just want to talk about briefly here as far as limitations. Just making sure that if you're using the sub-customers in QuickBooks Online, that the sub-customer does exist and hasn't been moved to, let's say, another parent company, just making sure that the hierarchy is in the system and is correct. And then also just limitations, going back to the QuickBooks limitation, the 90 days, every 90 days having to re-authenticate with QuickBooks Online just so that they know that their tokens are being used correctly with them, and just making sure that they are happy with our integration being refreshed so there is no still data. One thing when you're dealing with integration, sometimes things aren't up to date, and just making sure that they're up to date is by refreshing that disconnect and reconnect with them every 90 days, which they kind of make us do nicely about it. And also if you yourselves are experiencing any issues with the integration, best thing to do is come back into it and allow it to go through. Now I'm just going to pause my screen for 1 second. And I'm just going to bring up that invoice again here. And so that's really the limitations of QuickBooks. Now I always recommend to, go to the review posted items. Now with QuickBooks Online, if you don't have an error, you're not going to get the review posted items. It is an extra line under integrated accounting. The other thing is if you do have an error right on the physical transaction that did error out, there will be a review posted items link, so you can definitely go to that. So that is it for the QuickBooks integration overview, mapping, naming convention, and limitations of QuickBooks. Now, we have spent almost a whole full hour on it just because I wanted to make sure that I touched everything with QuickBooks Online. Just again, I keep reiterating the fact that I just want to make sure that you are set up for success, just because integrations can be, a little bit tiring sometimes when you don't understand what's happening, and if it's after hours and support's not there for you, just making sure that you are as close as successful as you possibly can. Sometimes there's things that just come up that, you just can't expect that come up. And, it's one of those things you work with support to come up with a solution for. And the other things are just making sure the workflows are, 100% the way they need to be to use the integration. And it really comes down to, again, naming conventions and mapping, and that's why we hired the session today, just to make sure that we touch base on all of those. We do have a few minutes left. I'm not sure, Sophie, do you want to open it up for a few questions?
Yeah, actually, there's one good question, and this might be a good thing to clarify with you, Jeremy. We've got Kathleen asking if they should disconnect from their QuickBooks Online and reconnect every 90 days, even if there is no error. This happens just by default, doesn't it? That's what you were speaking towards at the beginning.
Correct, yes. Now, every 90 days from the last time you reconnect, either you'll get a message on the first transaction after that 90 days you try. You'll notice right here, there'll be like an error message, and it's going to say, your account needs to be reconnected, and it's going to give you a link to go to that spot to reconnect. If it doesn't give you an error message, I would recommend maybe just as good practice to reconnect. I wouldn't say every 90 days, just whenever, you're concerned that something might have happened with your QuickBooks. Let's say QuickBooks Online put a new update in, and they've got some new features, and you just want to make sure that all the data is in there the way you want it. Or let's say you've modified multiple services or multiple chart of accounts, and you just want to make sure that function point's reading it correctly. Any big changes or modifications done in the QuickBooks, I would recommend doing the reconnect just again so that function point's reading it correctly.
Awesome. Thanks, Jer. And then the other one is around overriding taxes in function point. Now, I know this one can be a bit tricky at times. Is that something that we have time to touch on today, or?
Yes, definitely. So the way the integration works, again, doing the mapping with the taxes. So when I say the mapping with taxes, let's just go back for a moment to the integrated accounting. I go to the setup, and we're going to go to the taxes here. So let's look at tax item GST. So let's say GST in this case is 5%. So when it tries to look in QuickBooks, it's looking for 5% of the value of the invoice. If QuickBooks is 5% with GST's rate, the invoice is going to go in 100% of the time. If you decide, you know what, you want 5.2%, or you think the calculation's wrong in function point, the integration is not going to allow you to override that amount, just because again it's looking for its relationship to QuickBooks. And if I add tax right now, and let's say submit my service groups, let's add GST. So in this case, it's $268. If you don't like that amount, I would recommend modifying the line item slightly to get to the amount you want. The reason behind that is QuickBooks is at 5%, function points at 5%. In order for it to go in QuickBooks, the value does have to be 5% of the total of the invoice, or total of the taxable items on the invoice. I should be more clear about that, because sometimes, let's say design isn't taxable, but account services, copywriting, and project management and printing are. It'd have to be 5% of the taxable amount for it to go into QuickBooks. If you want to give a client a discount and you want to take that off the tax, and you change this here to let's say like 160, for example, or you charge too much tax for whatever reason on the previous invoice, so you don't want them to have to charge tax on this invoice, I would suggest removing the tax altogether on this invoice. Manipulating this amount just takes the relationship between QuickBooks and Function Point away, and because the integration is looking for that relationship, it's going to error out and give you a message saying, in order to sync with QuickBooks Online, you can't have overridden tax.
Awesome, Jeremy. Thank you for touching on that. Honestly, the rest of the questions I'm kind of getting right now are more function point related, so I think I'm able to answer them sort of in the back end. Again, we're coming up on the top of the hour, so I think that's the end of our webinar, but if anyone would like to keep sending through questions, please feel free. I'll stay on here for another 5 minutes or so to continue answering them. You know, if something comes up in 10, 15 minutes and we're not on here anymore, please feel free to email success@functionpoint.com, and we are more than happy to either answer your questions or get you in touch with the people that can answer your questions. We're here to support you in any way we can. So thank you, everyone, for coming to join us today. Thank you, Jeremy, for tag teaming this with me. It was super fun having you on the webinar with me today. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you all probably in the fall when we start our next round of these webinars. So I also look forward to hearing feedback from everyone on what topics you would like to cover. Thanks, Jer. Any last words of wisdom?
Thank you so much. I'll use the Chris Wilson phrase, have at her, and keep the sales full.
Oh, you're just saying all the Chris Wilson phrases. What's the next one? Best day ever. I hope everyone has the best day ever.
Definitely. You got to stay positive when you're working with QuickBooks and finances.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a few weeks.